Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The cold was a living thing, a predator that stalked the edges of the bonfire's light. It crept under the threadbare wool of Avali's tunic, raising goose flesh on her arms and sinking its teeth deep into her bones. From the heart of the Grey Fallow Pack's clearing, the scent of roasting meat and hot, spiced cider was a taunt. A feast for a celebration she was not part of, but the cause of. Her own scent was a whisper of shame in the air, rain-damp earth, and the cloying sweetness of fear. Tonight, under the unforgiving gaze of a full moon, the bond she had carried like a fragile ember for 5 years would be publicly extinguished. The man whose future had been tethered to hers would finally cut the cord, and the whole pack was here to watch her fall. And in the hollow where a bond should have been, a reckless void opened wide. Eric Fenn stepped into the center of the ring of firelight, his posture radiating the easy confidence of a favored son. He was the future beta of the Grey Fallow Pack, his shoulders broad, his hair the color of sun-bleached straw, his wolf a powerful, restless presence just beneath his skin. Every eye was on him, full of admiration and respect. Then, as one, they turned to Avali, and the admiration curdled into a mixture of pity and contempt. She stood alone at the edge of the circle, a ghost before her own execution. "Avali Price," Elder Maeve called, her voice as brittle as autumn leaves. "Step forward." Avali's feet felt like stones, but they obeyed, carrying her across the packed earth until she stood before Eric. She kept her gaze fixed on the worn leather of his boots, unable to meet the cold blue of his eyes. She could feel the ghost of their connection, a faint thrumming line between their souls, thin and frayed from years of his neglect. He had never wanted her. From the day the fates had revealed their pairing, he had seen her as a burden, a small wolfless omega, born mute from a fever that had stolen her parents and her voice as a child. A flaw in his otherwise perfect lineage. "Eric Fenn," the elder continued, turning to him. "The laws of the pack are clear. A bond decreed by the fates is sacred, but our survival is more sacred still. You have petitioned the council. You have presented your case. State your claim now, before the pack and the moon as our witness." Eric's voice was loud, resonant, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I, Eric Fenn, son of Beta Gregor, do hereby reject the bond with Avali Price." A collective murmur rippled through the assembled pack, a sound like dry grass skittering in the wind. It was not a sound of surprise, but of grim satisfaction. They had all been waiting for this. "State your reasons," Elder Maeve commanded, her tone a mere formality. Eric finally looked at her, and the weight of his disgust was a physical blow. "The Grey Fallow Pack needs strength. It needs heirs. It needs a Luna worthy of its beta. Avali Price is barren of gift and spirit. She has no wolf to answer the call of the moon. Her silence is a weakness, her bloodline a dead end." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, carrying sneer that was meant for her and her alone, yet loud enough for all to hear. "I feel nothing for her. The bond is a phantom limb, a constant ache that reminds me only of what I lack, of the true mate the fates have denied me in favor of this." He gestured to her, a flick of his hand as if dismissing a piece of trash. Avali flinched, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. The heat of humiliation crept up her neck, a blistering tide. She could feel the phantom bond straining, the threads snapping one by one under the force of his public renunciation. It was an agony that had no sound, a scream trapped in her silent throat. "The council accepts your petition," Elder Maeve declared, raising her staff. "The bond is severed. By the law of claw and moon, you are unbound." Eric's shoulders relaxed. a visible shudder of relief passing through him. He looked younger, lighter. He turned his back on her without a second glance, walking back towards the warmth of the fire and the waiting arms of Lyra, the fiery she-wolf who had held his attention for years. A sly, triumphant smile touched Lyra's lips as she took his hand. The bond shattered. Avalee gasped. A silent, ragged breath that felt like swallowing glass. A cold, cavernous emptiness bloomed in her chest, where the weak but persistent hum of their connection had once resided. It was gone. She was truly, utterly alone. The world tilted, the firelight blurring into streaks of orange and gold. The jeering faces of the pack became distorted masks. She was adrift, an untethered boat in a black, merciless ocean. She turned and fled. No one stopped her. Her shame was a wall they were happy to let her hide behind. She stumbled away from the light, away from the sounds of renewed celebration, and plunged into the shadows of the ancient forest that bordered their territory. The air grew colder here, scented with damp moss and decaying leaves. The trees were twisted giants, their branches clawing at the moonlit sky. This was the edge of their lands, a place few ventured, where the scent of their pack faded and the wild, unclaimed world began. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, collapsing at the base of a monolithic oak whose roots broke the surface of the earth like the knuckles of a buried god. She pressed her cheek against the rough, cold bark, her body shaking with silent sobs. The tears wouldn't come. She was too empty for tears. She was a vessel scoured clean by shame, rejected, unbound, a nameless, worthless thing. What was she supposed to do now? An omega without a pack, without a mate, without a voice. She was a death sentence walking. She could stay and endure the daily pity and scorn, a constant reminder of Eric's triumph and her failure. Or she could leave, walking into the wildlands to be torn apart by rogues or claimed by a cruel alpha looking for a submissive toy. A twig snapped nearby. Avalee froze, her head snapping up. Her human senses were dull, but the primal instinct that lived in the place where her wolf should have been screamed danger. She scanned the oppressive darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was exposed, vulnerable. A figure detached itself from the shadow of a neighboring pine. He was tall and lean, wrapped in darkness as if it were a cloak. He moved with an unnatural silence, his feet making no sound on the leaf-strewn ground. He wasn't one of her pack. His scent was utterly alien, a strange and unsettling combination of winter frost, old stone, and something wilder, like the ozone scent of a lightning strike. He wore no pack markings, just dark, functional leather that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through her numb misery. A rogue. She had run right to her doom. She scrambled backwards, crab-walking over the gnarled roots until her back hit the solid trunk of the oak. She was trapped. She opened her mouth to scream, a useless, reflexive action that produced only a faint, choked gasp. The stranger stopped a dozen feet away, his presence a heavy weight in the frigid air. He didn't move with the restless aggression of a typical rogue. He was unnervingly still, his power contained, leashed. In the slivers of moonlight that pierced the canopy, she saw he had dark hair, falling unkempt over his brow, and a face carved with hard lines. A faint silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, a flaw that only made his features more arresting. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, calm, and utterly unreadable. They watched her not with hunger or malice, but with an unnerving, ancient stillness. He wasn't assessing her as prey. He was simply observing, minutes stretched into an eternity. The forest held its breath around them. He did not speak, did not move. He just watched her, his silent contemplation more unnerving than any threat. The fear began to recede, replaced by a strange, desperate curiosity. Who was he? What did he want? Her despair, raw and gaping, began to twist into something else, something reckless and wild. Eric had cast her off because she was nothing. The pack saw her as a void. But this stranger, he saw her. In his dispassionate gaze, she was not an object of pity or scorn. She was just a girl shivering at the base of a tree. An idea born of madness and grief took root in the barren soil of her soul. Anything was better than this emptiness. Any mark was better than being unmarked, unclaimed, unmade. A scar of her own choosing would be a victory over the wound Eric had inflicted. Slowly, shakily, she pushed herself to her feet. Her legs still trembled, but a strange resolve settled over her. She took a hesitant step towards him, then another. He remained perfectly still, a statue carved from night and silence, his eyes tracking her every movement. When she was close enough to touch him, she stopped. She could feel the subtle heat radiating from his body, see the faint rise and fall of his chest. He smelled of the wild, of places untouched by pack law. She lifted a trembling hand, and before she could lose her nerve, she tilted her own head to the side, exposing the pale, vulnerable skin of her neck. It was a universal gesture of submission, of offering. His gaze flickered down to her throat, then back to her eyes. For the first time, an emotion surfaced in their dark depths. It wasn't pity, it was something closer to recognition, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. He still said nothing. His silence was a question, a final chance for her to retreat. She didn't. She held his gaze, pouring all her shattered pride, all her desperate defiance into that one look. Please, her eyes begged. Overwrite his rejection. Fill this void. Mark me. Ruin me. Make me something other than nothing. He lifted his hand, his movements slow and deliberate. His fingers were cool and calloused as they brushed against her jaw, gently, almost reverently, tilting her head further. His thumbs stroked the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. A shudder went through her, not of fear, but of stark, terrifying anticipation. He leaned in, his dark hair brushing against her cheek. His breath was warm against her skin as he inhaled her scent, a long, deep draw that seemed to pull the very soul from her body. He didn't growl, he didn't make a sound. He simply lowered his head, and she felt the sharp pressure of his canines against her skin. Right over the juncture of her neck and shoulder, she squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the pain. It was sharp, searing, a blinding flash of white-hot agony that made her entire body arch. But it was followed by something else, something she had never imagined. It wasn't the simple claiming bite of a rogue. As his teeth pierced her flesh, a torrent of raw, elemental power flooded her veins. It was like being struck by lightning and drowned in the sea all at once. It was ancient and vast, a force that tasted of granite mountains, endless forests, and storm-racked skies. It slammed into the hollow emptiness inside her, not just filling it, but shattering its borders, expanding it, reforging it into something new and terrifying. Visions flashed behind her eyelids, a throne of black stone, a crown of winter thorns, a kingdom shrouded in mist. She felt a connection snap into place, a bond so profound and absolute it dwarfed the pathetic thread she had shared with Eric into utter insignificance. This was no simple mark. This was an anchor chaining her to the very bedrock of the world. The power was too much. Her senses overloaded. The world dissolved into a roaring vortex of light and sound. The last thing she felt was the stranger's strong arms catching her as her legs gave out, pulling her securely against a chest that was as solid and unyielding as a mountain. And as the darkness swallowed her whole, she thought she heard a voice, low and rough as stones, grinding together. A voice that seemed to echo not in the air, but directly in her soul. A single, possessive word. Mine. Avalie woke to the impossible sensation of softness. It was the first thing her senses registered, a gentle cocoon of warmth and weightlessness that was utterly alien. For a moment, suspended in the hazy twilight between sleep and awareness, she thought she was dreaming. The bedding beneath her was not the coarse spun wool and lumpy straw mattress of her cot in the Omega's den. It was silk, cool and fluid against her skin, and the mattress yielded to the curve of her spine as if it were made of clouds. A heavy quilt of deep blue velvet, impossibly plush, covered her. Her next sensation was scent. The air was not the familiar earthy mix of wood smoke, sweat, and damp fur that defined the gray fallow pack. This air was clean and warm, fragrant with the subtle, calming notes of dried lavender and the clean, sweet smell of beeswax. A fire crackled softly somewhere nearby, its gentle pops and hisses a soothing counterpoint to the frantic pounding that was just beginning in her chest. Her eyes snapped open. She was not in the forest. She was not in the den. She was in a vast baronial chamber, larger than the entire Greyfallow Great Hall. The ceiling soared high above her, lost in shadows where heavy dark wood beams crisscrossed. A colossal stone fireplace, big enough for a man to stand in, dominated one wall, the source of the fire's comforting sound. The flames danced merrily, casting flickering golden light across a room furnished with pieces she couldn't have imagined. A carved oak wardrobe, a velvet chaise lounge, and a heavy tapestry depicting a hunting scene with wolves the size of ponies. The floor was covered in a thick, intricate rug, its patterns rich with colors she'd only ever seen on the wings of rare butterflies. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the fog of confusion. She sat up, the silk sheets pooling around her waist. She was wearing a simple chemise of fine, soft linen, not her own rough tunic. Her body ached, a deep thrumming soreness in her muscles, but she felt whole, more than whole. She felt a strange vitality humming just beneath her skin, a current of energy that was both foreign and intimately hers. Then she remembered the rejection, the flight into the woods, the silent stranger with eyes like the winter sky at midnight. The bite. Her hand flew to her neck. Her fingers brushed against skin that was tender and slightly raised. There was no pain, just a persistent, radiating warmth, like a small sun embedded in her flesh. This was the source of the energy she felt. She scrambled out of the massive bed, her bare feet sinking into the plushness of the rug. Her legs felt stronger than she remembered, steady and sure. The room was dizzyingly large, but she found what she was, looking for on the wall opposite the bed, a tall silver-framed mirror, its surface polished to a flawless sheen. She approached it hesitantly, as if it might shatter at her touch. The girl who stared back at her was both familiar and a stranger. Her face was still hers, pale, with the wide, haunted gray eyes and the dark, tangled hair of the prize line. But the perpetual shadow of weariness that had clung to her for years was gone. Her eyes were clear, and a faint, healthy flush colored her cheeks. She looked rested, alive. And there, on the juncture of her neck and shoulder, was the mark. It was not the angry, torn wound she had expected. It was not a rogue's jagged claim of ownership. It was a perfect, intricate sigil. 3 distinct canine impressions, deeper and larger than any she had ever seen, formed the points of a triangle. But within the triangle, the skin had healed into a pattern of swirling, silvery scar tissue that looked like a stylized wolf's head crowned with thorns. It pulsed with a faint inner light, a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to beat in time with her own heart. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And deep in the oldest, most primal part of her mind, a part she never knew she possessed, she recognized it, not from sight, but from instinct, from blood memory passed down through 1,000 generations. It was the Brimvale seal, the mark of the Alpha King. A strangled gasp, thin and voiceless, escaped her lips. Her knees went weak. She gripped the edge of the ornate dressing table beside the mirror to keep from collapsing. The stranger, the silent rogue in the woods. He wasn't a rogue. He was Keldrick Brimvale, the Ghost King, the Alpha of Alphas, who had vanished from the capital 5 years ago after a bloody dispute with the High Council, leaving the kingdom to be ruled by a squabbling pack of regents. He was a legend, a whispered threat used to frighten pups. They said he was cursed, that his wolf was a feral monster, that he stalked the wildlands as a phantom, waiting, and he had marked her, not as a rogue's plaything, but as his mate. The bond she felt was not the faint frayed thread she had shared with Eric. This was a steel cable, a living conduit of immense power that coiled in her gut and sang in her blood. It connected her to him, to the silent man with the scarred eyebrow, and through him to something vast and ancient. She could feel the echo of his own strength, a sensation of unshakable authority, of old stone and cold stars. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of sensation that threatened to drown her. She was Avalee Price, a mute, a wolfless omega, a rejected stray from a minor pack on the kingdom's fringe. And she was now the mate of the most powerful, feared, and mythic shifter on the continent, the Queen. The thought was so ludicrous, so impossible, it bordered on madness. She wanted to laugh, a hysterical, soundless peal of insanity. She wanted to scream until her throat bled. The heavy, wooden door to the chamber creaked open. Avilee spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Two figures stood in the doorway, their silhouettes framed by the torchlight of the corridor beyond. They were enormous, both well over 6 feet tall, clad in polished black steel armor that bore the same crowned wolf sigil that now adorned her skin. Their faces were grim, their sense a disciplined blend of steel, leather, and unwavering loyalty. They were royal guards. They did not enter fully, they simply stood at attention, their presence an impassable wall. One of them, a man with a jaw like a block of granite and a thick braided beard, inclined his head respectfully. "My lady," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Forgive the intrusion. We saw you were awake. Is there anything you require?" My lady, the title was a physical blow. She shook her head, taking a stumbling step back. Her mind raced, a frantic scramble of questions she could not ask. Where am I? Who are you? Why am I here? What have you done to me? The guard seemed to understand her silent panic. His expression softened fractionally. "You are safe here, my lady. This is the Northern Citadel. You are under the king's protection." The king's protection. Keldrick's protection. She was his prisoner then. A prize he had stolen from the woods and locked away in this opulent cage. The terror returned, sharp and suffocating. What did he want from her? A king didn't mate with a flawed omega out of pity. He had a purpose, a reason. And she was a pawn in a game whose rules she couldn't begin to comprehend. She gestured towards the door, a questioning look on her face. "Can I leave?" The second guard, younger and with sharp, watchful eyes, answered before his companion could. "It is not safe for you beyond this chamber. Not yet. The king has given strict orders. No one is to see you until he returns." Returns? So he wasn't here. He had marked her and vanished, leaving her in the care of his soldiers. The realization brought a strange mix of relief and a sharp, unexpected pang of abandonment. It was a feeling she knew all too well. The bearded guard shot his partner a warning glance. "He will return soon," he said, his tone meant to be reassuring. "In the meantime, Elspeth will attend you. She will bring food and water for bathing." He stepped back, and a woman entered from the hall. She was older, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a plain, practical dress. Her face was stern, but her eyes held a flicker of something Avilee recognized. Weary sympathy. She carried a tray laden with a steaming pitcher, a basin of water, and folded linens. Elspeth curtsied, a stiff, formal movement. "My lady Avilee," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. She placed the tray on a small table. "His Majesty instructed that your every comfort be seen to. His Majesty." The title echoed in the silent chamber, a pronouncement of her new reality. Avilee stared at the old woman, her mind reeling. She was no one. She was a cast-off. How could she possibly be the concern of a king? A mad thought struck her. Maybe this was all a mistake. He had found her in the dark, desperate and broken. Perhaps he hadn't seen what she was. Wolfless, mute, worthless. When he returned, when he saw her clearly in the light of day, he would realize his error. He would cast her aside, just as Eric had. The thought was a familiar, agonizing pain, yet it was almost preferable to the crushing weight of this impossible new identity. The shame of a king's rejection would be absolute, a wound from which she would never recover. Elspeth seemed to sense the storm raging inside her. "You have been through a great ordeal, child," she said softly, her formal tone slipping into something more motherly. "Rest, eat, gather your strength. You will need it." The woman's words were a prophecy, heavy with unspoken meaning. Avilee watched as Elspeth laid out cloths and poured steaming, herb-scented water into the basin. The simple domestic act was so at odds with the royal guards at the door and the king's seal burning on her skin that it made the world feel tilted and unreal. She allowed the woman to help her wash the grime of the forest from her skin. her limbs moving with a strange detachment, as if they belonged to someone else. As Elspeth gently dabbed the cloth around the mark on her neck, Avalie flinched, not from pain, but from the intimacy of the act. "It is a powerful mark," Elspeth murmured, her eyes full of a kind of awe. "The oldest of the old lines. I have not seen its like in my lifetime." Avalie looked at her own reflection again. The silver sigil seemed to glow brighter, the crowned wolf staring back at her with phantom eyes. It was a brand, a claim, a declaration to the world. Avalie Price was gone, erased in the dark of the woods. In her place was this creature, this girl marked by a phantom king, draped in silk and guarded by warriors. She felt a profound and terrifying sense of loss, a mourning for the simple, painful life she had known. It was a miserable existence, but at least it had been hers. This belonged to him, to the Ghost King. She was his. Just as Elspeth finished, a sharp knock echoed from the door. One of the guards opened it a crack, spoke in low tones to someone in the hall, then opened it wider. A man strode into the room, his presence immediately commanding the space. He was not as large as the guards, but he carried an aura of sharp, dangerous intelligence. He had a lean, wolfish face, sharp gray eyes that missed nothing, and dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. He wore fine, dark leathers, but they were the clothes of a courtier, not a warrior. He stopped in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over Avalie, analytical and intense. Elspeth immediately dropped into a low, deferential curtsy. "Lord Corvin," she breathed. The man ignored her. His eyes were fixed on the mark on Avalie's neck. A flicker of disbelief, quickly masked, crossed his features. He took another step closer, his eyes then rising to meet hers. There was no warmth in his expression, only a grim, calculating assessment. He bowed his head, a curt, formal gesture that was more a recognition of her station than a true show of respect. His voice, when he spoke, was as sharp and precise as cut glass. "So it is true," he said, the words hanging in the air like icicles. The rumors were not exaggerated. He looked her up and down once more, taking in her simple chemise, her bare feet, her wide, terrified eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible sneer touched the corner of his lips. "Welcome to the Citadel," he said, his voice laced with an irony so fine it was almost undetectable. He then executed a perfect courtly bow, his movements mocking in their grace. The final words he spoke landed like the tolling of a funeral bell, sealing her fate and shattering the last vestiges of the girl she used to be. "Your Majesty." The words, "Your Majesty," echoed in the cavernous silence of the room. They did not feel like an honor. They felt like the bars of a cage slamming shut around her. Avalie stood frozen, her bare feet cold against the plush rug, the simple linen chemise a pathetic shield against the man's dissecting gaze. Lord Corvin watched her, his sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing. Not the tremor in her hands, not the wild panic in her expression, not the way she instinctively guarded the glowing mark on her neck as if to hide it. His lips quirked in a smile that held no humor, only a dry, intellectual curiosity. "I see the king neglected to provide an instruction manual with his gift," he remarked, his tone silky and dangerous. "I am Corvin, the king's steward, his hand, his counsel, his keeper of secrets. And now, it seems, your humble servant." The title was a mockery. He was no one's servant. He was a predator in a courtier's skin, circling her, scenting out her weaknesses. And she had so many. She stared back at him, her silence her only defense. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her muteness, not as a private shame, but as a crippling strategic disadvantage. She could not question him. She could not command him. She could not even tell him to leave. She was a queen with no voice, a figurehead waiting to be manipulated. Corvin seemed to read her thoughts. "Your quietude will be a challenge," he mused, tapping a long, elegant finger against his chin. "The southern courts thrive on whispers, lies, and pretty declarations. Here in the north, we prefer a more direct approach. But silence is a vacuum, and every ambitious lord in this kingdom will be rushing to fill it with his own words, his own intentions. He began to pace, his movements economical and precise, like a wolf mapping the edges of its territory. Let me illuminate your new reality, since His Majesty is otherwise engaged. You are in Brimvale Citadel, the ancestral heart of the Alpha Kings, a fortress that has not housed a queen in over a century. For 5 years, King Keldric has been a ghost, a myth. The High Council in the capital grew fat and complacent, believing him broken by the curse, content to rule in his stead. They were wrong. His eyes glinted with a fierce, cold light. By marking you, he has done more than take a mate. He has thrown down a gauntlet. He has declared his return. A king's power is tied to his line, to the promise of an heir. By sealing a bond, he has announced to the entire kingdom that the Brimvale line is not dead. You, my quiet little Omega, are an act of war. An act of war, a pawn, a symbol. The words stripped away any lingering fantasy that this was about her. The man in the forest hadn't seen a desperate girl. He'd seen a tool, a means to an end. The thought was a bitter poison, burning away the strange, terrifying warmth the bond had given her. It was just another form of rejection, grander and more cruel than Eric's. Avali shook her head, a small, frantic gesture of denial. This was a mistake. She was a mistake. She took a half-step back, wanting to retreat to the safety of the massive bed, to hide under the velvet quilt and disappear. Ah, but it is no mistake, Corvin said, his voice dropping. He stopped pacing and met her gaze directly. Do not think for a second this was an act of random passion in the woods. Keldric does nothing by accident. He has been watching the packs, searching. The question that every lord from the Sunken Coast to the Frostfang Peaks is asking is, why you? His gaze dropped pointedly to her simple chemise, her bare feet, her unkempt hair. The question was an insult, and it landed with unerring accuracy. Why would the king choose something so obviously broken? Before she could wither completely under his scrutiny, Elspeth, who had been standing silently by the door, cleared her throat. Lord Corvin, the lady is exhausted. She needs rest. And proper attire. Corvin gave a curt nod. His point made. Indeed. Dress her, Elspeth. See that she is presentable. The citadel is already buzzing. They have seen the royal guard stationed at her door. They know the king has returned with a prize. It is best they see a queen, not a frightened stray. He turned and strode out of the room without another word, leaving a chill in his wake. The heavy door clicked shut, and Avali finally allowed herself to breathe. She sagged against the dressing table, her reflection showing a girl impossibly out of her depth. Elspeth's touch on her arm was gentle. Pay him no mind, my lady. Corvin's heart is a block of ice, but his loyalty to the king is absolute. He protects him even from himself. She guided Avali towards a large carved wardrobe. Now let us find you something more fitting for the Queen of the North. Inside the wardrobe was a collection of gowns that made Avali's head spin. They were not the frivolous, silken creations of the southern courts she'd heard stories about. These were clothes of substance and strength, made of deep-hued velvets, rich wools, and soft, supple leather. Elspeth chose a gown of dark forest green, the color of pine needles in shadow, with simple but elegant silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It was warm and heavy, a comforting weight that felt like armor. As Avali dressed, she felt the transformation taking place. The simple Omega from the Grey Fallow pack was disappearing, replaced by this strange, noble woman in the mirror. The clothes didn't fit her, not really. They were a costume, and she was an imposter playing a role she hadn't auditioned for. The king has summoned his bannermen, Elspeth said, her voice low as she braided Avali's long, dark hair. The lords of the northern packs. They arrive within the week. They will come to see you, to judge the woman their king has chosen. A week. She had a week to become a queen. The panic threatened to swallow her whole. Once she was dressed, Elspeth led her from the chamber. The 2 royal guards fell into step behind them, their heavy armored footfalls a constant, intimidating rhythm. The corridor outside was long and forged from the same dark gray stone as the fireplace, lit by flickering torches that cast dancing, monstrous shadows. The air was cold, carrying the scent of stone, dust, and time. This place felt ancient, sleeping, and she had the unnerving sensation that her presence was waking it up. They did not go to a great hall. Instead, Elspeth led her to a smaller, more private dining chamber. But as they walked, they passed servants who froze in their duties, their eyes going wide as they saw her, quickly dropping into deep bows and curtsies. Avalie could feel their stares on her back long after they had passed, could hear the eruption of hushed, frantic whispers. Is that her? The one he brought back? And Omega? Look at the mark. The whispers followed her, unseen but as sharp as needles, pricking at the fragile shell of her composure. She lowered her head, focusing on the stone floor, wishing she could become invisible. She felt naked, exposed, a curiosity pinned to a board for all to see. The humiliation she'd felt in her own pack was a pale shadow compared to this. Here, the stakes were 1,000 times higher. In the dining chamber, a small meal was laid out on a heavy oak table before a roaring fire. Warm bread, cheese, smoked fish, and a steaming broth. She sat, but she couldn't eat. Her stomach was a knot of anxiety. Every sound, every flicker of a shadow made her jump. It was in this state of heightened fear, feeling the walls closing in, that she felt it. A sudden, powerful wave of something washed over her through the bond. It wasn't a thought, not a word. It was a feeling, pure and undiluted, pouring into her from a great distance. It was the icy calm of a predator on the hunt, a fierce, unwavering possessiveness, and beneath it all, a deep, resonant hum of sheer, unshakable power. It was Keldrick. He was feeling the echoes of her panic through their connection, and he was sending back his own strength, a silent, primal command. Be still. You are mine. You are safe. The force of it took her breath away. It slammed into her fear, not erasing it, but encasing it in a shell of borrowed confidence. Her trembling hands steadied. The frantic hammering of her heart slowed to a strong, even beat. She sat up straighter, the phantom sensation of his will a steel rod pressed against her spine. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing she had ever experienced. She was not alone in her own mind anymore. He was there, a ghost in her blood, a king on a distant throne inside her soul. She lifted her head, her eyes no longer downcast. When Elspeth looked at her in concern, she saw the change. The frightened girl was gone, replaced by a woman with a strange, unnerving stillness in her eyes. A stillness that was not her own. Later that evening, back in the sanctuary of her chambers, the borrowed calm began to fade, leaving her feeling hollowed out and strangely bereft. She paced before the fire, the green wool of the gown swishing around her ankles. The king's power had been a crutch, and now that it was gone, she felt weaker than ever. She was addicted to a feeling she couldn't control, dependent on a man she didn't know. Elspeth entered, her arms laden with heavy furs. The nights are cold in the citadel, Your Majesty. The stone holds the frost. She laid the furs at the foot of the bed, but there was something else with them, a heavy, dark garment that she handled with a reverence Avalie hadn't seen before. It was a cloak, made of thick black wolf fur, worn and heavy with age. The leather ties were cracked, and the clasp was a single, large, unadorned piece of obsidian. This was his, Elspeth said softly, her voice full of meaning. He wore it in the wildlands. I thought it might bring you some comfort. Avalie stared at the cloak. It seemed to absorb the firelight, a patch of pure darkness in the warm room. It was a piece of him, of the silent stranger in the woods. Hesitantly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the coarse fur. The moment her skin made contact, the world exploded. His scent rose from the cloak, not faint, but overwhelmingly potent. Winter frost, old stone, and wild, untamed wolf. It filled her lungs, bypassed her mind, and struck the bond like a hammer hitting a bell. A torrent of sensation, raw and unfiltered, flooded her. It wasn't just a feeling this time. It was a vision, a memory, a moment of his life pouring directly into her. She saw through his eyes, the moon glaring down on a snow-covered landscape, the bite of the wind, the thrill of a silent hunt. She felt the powerful muscles of his body moving with lethal grace, the deep rumbling growl in his chest. And she felt his emotions, a profound aching loneliness that was as vast as the winter landscape, a fierce burning determination that had honed him into a weapon, and a sudden shocking surge of raw possessive longing that was aimed with laser-like intensity at a girl with haunted gray eyes, shivering in the woods. Avalie cried out, a silent, tearing gasp, and stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. She was shaking violently, her legs threatening to give way. She had just felt his soul. She stared at the cloak, now lying on the furs like a sleeping beast. It was a tangible link to him, a relic infused with his very essence. He was not just a ghost in her blood. He was a living, breathing man, filled with a loneliness that mirrored her own. And in his heart, in that brief, stolen moment, she had felt not the cold calculation of a king choosing a pawn, but the desperate, possessive recognition of a male finding his mate. The knowledge didn't make her safe. It didn't make her a queen. But as she stood there, trembling in the firelight, it changed everything. The cloak became her sanctuary. In the days that followed, Avalie found herself wrapped in its heavy, fur-lined depths, the potent scent of the Ghost King a constant, grounding presence. The vision did not repeat, but the connection remained, a low hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. She would be sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, and would suddenly feel a phantom chill of a high mountain pass, or taste the metallic tang of bloodlust on her tongue, or feel a surge of fierce, unyielding resolve that was not her own. They were echoes, fragments of his existence bleeding into hers through the bond. She was changing. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was no longer her master. His power, his loneliness, his possessive longing for her, these things had become an unlikely armor. She was his, and in that ownership, she found a strange, terrifying strength. She began to observe the citadel, to watch the servants and guards from her window, her silence no longer a void of helplessness, but a cloak of invisibility. She learned the rhythms of the fortress, the changing of the guard, the paths the servants took, the way Lord Corvin moved through the halls like a shadow, his influence touching everything. Corvin watched her in turn. He saw her wrapped in the king's cloak, saw the new, unnerving stillness in her eyes, but he misinterpreted it. He saw a traumatized creature clinging to the scent of its captor, a simple Omega overwhelmed by her new reality. He brought her books on the history of the northern houses, maps of the kingdom, scrolls detailing treaties and blood feuds. He was attempting to forge a queen, to give her the tools she would need to survive. Avalie accepted them, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar runes and lineages. She absorbed the information, but her true education was coming through the bond, in phantom sensations of winter and will. On the fourth day, the horns sounded from the battlements, a deep, resonant cry that rolled across the snow-dusted courtyards and echoed off the black stone of the citadel. The sound vibrated in Avalie's bones. The bannermen had arrived. From the arrow-slit window in her chamber, she watched them ride in. They were not a shining host of knights like in the southern songs. They were a grim, hard tide of men and women forged by the merciless north. They rode heavy, shaggy horses that breathed steam in the frigid air, and their banners bore the sigils of their packs, the snarling crag wolf of the Iron Fangs, the stoic bear of the Stonehides, the swift snow leopard of the Pine Ridge clan. They were large, all of them, wrapped in furs and boiled leather, their faces etched with old scars and older suspicions. Their alpha energy washed over the citadel in a palpable wave, a low thrum of contained violence and brutal pride. Elspeth entered the room, her face pale and drawn. "It is time, Your Majesty." She held out a gown, not of velvet or wool, but of dark, supple leather, dyed the color of a stormy sky. It was reinforced at the shoulders and waist, more like ceremonial armor than a dress. It was a statement. I am of the north. I am not soft. Avalie allowed herself to be dressed, her movements calm and deliberate. The leather was cool against her skin, a second, stronger hide. Elspeth left her hair unbound, a dark cascade down her back. When she was ready, Lord Corvin appeared at her door. His sharp eyes took in her appearance, and a flicker of something, not quite approval, but a grudging respect, passed across his face. "They are gathered in the great hall," he said, his voice clipped. "They are restless. They have ridden for days on a ghost summons, and they find no ghost, only whispers of a girl he pulled from a backwater wood." He offered her his arm. "A piece of advice, Your Majesty. Say nothing." He gave a thin, humorless smile, "A skill you have already perfected. But more than that, show nothing, no fear, no weakness. Let them look upon you and see only a reflection of their own questions. Let them break themselves on your silence." Avilee did not take his arm. She walked past him, out into the torchlit hall, her spine straight. The two royal guards fell in behind her, their presence more intimidating than ever. Corvin paused for a second, surprised. Then a slow, calculating smile touched his lips. He followed. The doors to the great hall were immense, carved with the history of the Brimvale kings. As they were pulled open, the sound that hit her was a physical force, the low growl of dozens of powerful shifters, the clink of goblets on wood, the murmur of harsh, guttural voices. The air was thick with the sense of roasting meat, mulled wine, wet fur, and raw, aggressive power. She stepped inside, and a wave of silence rolled through the hall, crushing the noise in an instant. The room was a cavern of stone and shadow, dominated by a hearth large enough to roast an ox. Every northern lord and their chosen retinue were there, 100 pairs of predatory eyes fixing on her as she walked the long path to the raised dais at the far end of the room. On the dais stood a single massive throne, carved from the black heart of a petrified weirwood tree, its back shaped into the image of a snarling, crowned wolf. It was empty. Avilee felt their gazes like claws, dissecting her, judging her. They saw the omega in her scent, faint as it was beneath the leather and herbs. They saw her youth. They saw the slender frame that promised no great warrior strength. They saw a mistake, a weakness at the heart of their kingdom. She could feel their contempt, their disbelief. It was the bonfire clearing all over again, but on a terrifyingly grand scale. She stopped before the empty throne and turned to face them. She did not tremble. She did not lower her eyes. She met their stares, one by one, her expression a calm, unreadable mask. Through the bond, she felt a distant echo of Keldrick's will, a phantom touch of ice and iron, and she drew on it, letting it fill her. Her silence became a challenge. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was a living thing, coiling in the silent hall. Then a massive figure detached himself from the crowd. He was a giant of a man, his face a roadmap of old scars, his beard braided with iron rings. His scent was of iron, blood, and old rage. This was Lord Boren of the Iron Fang Pack, the most powerful and belligerent of Keldrick's bannermen. He strode to the foot of the dais, his gaze dripping with scorn. He did not bow. "We answer the call of a king we have not seen in 5 winters," he boomed, his voice like rocks grinding together. "We ride to his citadel, and we find him gone. In his place, we find this." He gestured to Avilee with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "A stray. A wolfless, voiceless Omega girl from some forgotten corner of the woods, wearing a mark she has no right to bear." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled lords. Boren's eyes narrowed, pinning Avilee in place. The North needs a queen of strength, a she-wolf who can bear true heirs, whose howl can rally the packs, not a silent waif to warm the king's bed while he runs from his duties. "Where is the strength of the North in you, girl? Where is our king? Does he hide behind your skirts?" The insult was brutal, public, and aimed to shatter her. Avilee felt a tremor of the old fear, the familiar sting of shame. He was saying what Eric had said, what they all thought. She was worthless, broken. But as the shame rose, something else rose to meet it. It was the echo of Keldrick's power, a cold, deadly rage that was not entirely her own. She lifted her chin, her gray eyes meeting Boren's without a flicker of fear. She did not need to speak. Her defiance was absolute, silent, and it infuriated him. Boren took a step onto the dais, his hand moving towards the hilt of the great sword on his back. "I will not bow to this mistake," he roared. The king has lost his mind. He shames us all. The royal guards behind her shifted, their hands moving to their own weapons. But they were only two against a hall of alphas. Corvin stood like a statue, his face pale, his eyes wide with calculation, watching to see how this gambit would play out. And then, everything stopped. A sudden, absolute silence fell over the hall, deeper and more profound than before. A pressure descended, an invisible weight of authority so immense that it forced the breath from every lung. The torches seemed to dim, the shadows deepening. A new scent cut through the thick air, clean, cold, and utterly dominant. Winter frost, old stone, ozone. He was here. Avali's head snapped towards the throne. He was standing beside it, in the deep shadow where its monstrous form met the wall. He had not walked there. He had not made a sound. He had simply appeared, a ghost made solid. He was not dressed in kingly regalia, but in the same dark, functional leathers he had worn in the forest. The black wolf fur cloak settled on his shoulders. His dark hair was unruly, his face etched with weariness, but his presence was an undisputed fact, as real and unyielding as a mountain. The scar through his eyebrow seemed to catch the faint light, a silver flaw in a face carved from granite. Lord Boren froze, his hand still on his sword, his face paling. Every lord in the hall, every warrior, every servant, bowed their heads as one, a ripple of submission that was instinctive and total. They did not bow to a crown or a title. They bowed to the raw, overwhelming power of the alpha of alphas. Keldrick's dark, unreadable eyes swept over the hall for a fraction of a second, dismissing them all. Then they found Avali. They locked onto hers, and for a moment, the entire world narrowed to the space between them. The bond between them flared, no longer a faint echo but a roaring inferno. She felt the full, undiluted force of his being. His weariness from a long journey, his cold fury at Boren's challenge, and a wave of possessiveness so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He ignored Boren. He ignored Corvin. He ignored the 100 bowed heads of his bannermen. He walked towards her, his movements silent and fluid, a predator in his own hall. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the cold radiating from his cloak. The world held its breath. He raised a hand, his fingers calloused and cool. With a shocking, unexpected gentleness, he cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin beneath her ear. Then, his gaze still locked on hers, he moved his hand to her neck, his thumb pressing directly over the silver sigil of his mark. The mark blazed. A brilliant silver-white light erupted from her skin, so bright it made several of the lords gasp and flinch back. The light illuminated his face, casting him in an ethereal glow, his dark eyes seeming to drink in her soul. The message was unmistakable, a declaration written in silent fire for all to see. She is mine, her body, her soul, her name, mine. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear, his breath a warm shock against her cold skin. His voice was a low, rough growl, a sound that vibrated through her bones, meant for her alone yet somehow carrying to every corner of the dead silent hall. "Did they frighten you, little mate?" His words were a spark in a room full of gunpowder. The question was intimate, possessive, a claim made not with a roar, but with a whisper that was somehow more damning. The brilliant silver light from the mark on Avali's neck subsided, but the afterimage burned behind every eye in the hall. The Ghost King was real, he was here, and the silent Omega Girl was undeniably, irrevocably his. Avali stared up into his face, trapped in the deep, unreadable calm of his eyes. She could feel the wild, chaotic thrum of the bond, a symphony of his emotions playing through her own nerves, the ironclad control he exerted over his own fury, the bone-deep satisfaction of claiming her so publicly, and a startlingly tender current of concern directed solely at her. He was waiting for an answer. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. No, a lie, but a necessary one. Showing fear now would validate Boren's accusations of her weakness. A faint, dangerous smile touched Keldrick's lips, a barely there shift of muscle that did not reach his eyes. He knew she was lying, but it was the answer he wanted. It was the answer the moment demanded. His thumb stroked the mark one last time, a silent promise, before he let his hand fall. He turned slowly, a predator finally acknowledging the lesser beast in its den. His gaze fell upon Lord Boren of the Iron Fangs, who still stood frozen on the steps of the dais, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. The sheer, oppressive weight of Keldrick's alpha presence doubled, pressing down on the giant lord, forcing the air from his lungs. Boren's bravado evaporated like mist in a harsh sun, replaced by the primal, instinctual fear of a challenger facing a superior. "Lord Boren," Keldrick said, his voice no longer a whisper, but a low, carrying rumble that seemed to come from the very stones of the citadel. "You seem to have questions for your queen." He didn't say, "my queen," he said, "your queen." The distinction was a razor's edge, a test of loyalty presented to every shifter in the hall. Boren swallowed hard, the sound loud in the dead silence. He finally seemed to remember himself, dropping to one knee in a clumsy, belated show of fealty. His head was bowed, his eyes fixed on the stone floor. "Your Majesty," he rasped, his booming voice reduced to a strained croak. I spoke out of turn. My concern for the North, it made my tongue reckless." "Your concern," Keldrick repeated, the words flat and devoid of emotion. He walked down the steps of the dais, circling Boren like a wolf inspects a trap. "You are concerned that she is a silent waif. You are concerned that she is wolfless. You question her right to bear my mark. You question my right to give it." With every statement, the pressure in the room increased. Avalee could feel it as a physical force, a crushing weight that made her own bones ache. The other lords stood like statues of ice, afraid to even breathe, lest they draw that suffocating attention to themselves. "I question nothing, my king," Boren choked out, sweat beading on his brow. "I accept your choice." "No," Keldrick said softly, stopping directly behind the kneeling lord. "You do not. Your scent is sour with defiance. Your heart beats with the rhythm of rebellion. You see a quiet Omega, and you see weakness. You see my mate, and you see an opportunity." He placed a hand on Boren's massive shoulder. The gesture looked almost casual, but Boren flinched as if he had been touched by a hot iron. "You have forgotten the old ways, Boren. You have forgotten the laws that bind us, the blood that forged us." Keldrick's eyes lifted, sweeping across the sea of bowed heads. "All of you have forgotten. You have sat in your keeps for 5 years, growing comfortable, thinking your king was a ghost, a memory. You have forgotten what it means to be led, what it means to obey." He looked back at Avalee, his expression unreadable. A challenge was issued in this hall. An insult was given to the queen. The old laws are very clear on the price of such an insult. Corvin, who had been watching with the rapt attention of a scholar at a vivisection, took a hesitant step forward. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice tight. "Perhaps a fine, a stripping of lands." "Silence, Corvin," Keldrick commanded without turning. Corvin froze, his mouth snapping shut, a faint flush of anger and humiliation on his sharp features. Keldrick's gaze returned to Boren. "There is only one price. The price is blood." A collective silent gasp went through the hall. This was not a political maneuver. This was a regression to the most brutal, primal laws of their kind. A formal duel of dominance. A reckoning. "No, Your Majesty, Boren began, but Keldrick's grip on his shoulder tightened, and the bigger man let out a strangled grunt of pain. "You will not dishonor her further by refusing the consequences of your actions," Keldrick stated, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You will meet me in the training yard at dawn. You will meet me, or my wolves will hunt you down in your own keep and drag your carcass back here for the crows." He released Boren, pushing him slightly. "Now get out of my sight." Boren scrambled to his feet and all but fled the great hall, his retinue hurrying after him like pups abandoning a sinking ship. The spell was broken. The remaining lords, stirred, their expressions a mixture of terror and a grim, bloody excitement. They had come for answers and had been given a promise of violence. Keldrick paid them no mind. He turned back to Avalee, the alpha pressure receding, the suffocating weight lifting from the room. He walked back to her, his presence shielding her from the curious, fearful stares of his bannermen. He held out his hand. Come. It was not a request. Avali looked at his outstretched hand. It was large, calloused, scarred across the knuckles. It was the hand of a warrior, a king, a killer. It was the hand that had held her jaws so gently in the forest, the hand that had just condemned a man to death. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before placing her own smaller, paler hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of pure energy that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest. He led her from the dais, not towards the exit, but towards a smaller, unassuming door set into the wall behind the throne. The lords parted before them like a tide, their heads still bowed, not daring to meet their king's eyes. The door led to a spiral stone staircase, lit by a single torch. As the heavy door boomed shut behind them, cutting off the sounds of the great hall, Keldric finally spoke again, his voice tight with a tension he had not shown before his men. "Are you unharmed?" Aveli nodded, her throat tight. Unharmed? Her entire world had been shattered and remade in the last hour. They climbed in silence, the only sound their footsteps on the ancient stone. The staircase opened into a private study, a stark contrast to the grand, cold spaces of the citadel she had seen. It was a room of warmth and substance. Bookshelves overflowed with scrolls and leather-bound tomes. Maps were spread across a massive oak table. A fire crackled in a modest hearth, and 2 worn leather armchairs were pulled up before it. The scent of old paper, wood smoke, and Keldric himself filled the space. It was his den, his heart. He released her hand and walked to the fire, staring down into the flames. He seemed to carry the weight of the entire world on his broad shoulders. Avali stood uncertainly by the door, feeling like an intruder in this deeply personal space. "He deserved it," Keldric said, his back still to her. "Boren has been testing the borders of my authority for years. His challenge was not just to you, but to me. It had to be answered." He sounded weary, as if explaining the grim necessities of his existence. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw past the Ghost King, past the Alpha of Alphas. In the soft firelight, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften, and the shadows under his eyes spoke of years of sleepless nights. She saw the man, the lonely, burdened man whose soul she had touched through his cloak. "I know this is not what you would have chosen," he said, his voice softer now. Life of peace away from all this. It is what you deserve." He took a step towards her, then stopped, as if held back by an invisible barrier. "The fates are cruel. They bound you to me, to this." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the maps and the stone walls, at the kingdom that was his burden. "I spent 5 years in the Wildlands, Avali, not hiding, hunting. The men on the High Council, the ones who drove me out, they are not just ambitious. They are rotten. They have been dealing with our enemies, the human hunters who call themselves the Argent Order, selling our people, our territories, for power and coin." His revelation was a cold shock. The Argent Order were boogeymen, horror stories told to shifter pups, fanatical, silver-wielding hunters who believed all shifters were abominations to be eradicated. "I could not fight them from the throne, tangled in their laws and their lies," he continued, his voice a low, bitter rasp. "So I became a ghost. I cut them off at the source, one by one, in the dark places where their treachery festered. My work is almost done." But they grew desperate. They knew I would return. They began to search for a way to control me, to break me. The seers told them of a prophecy, that my power could only be anchored, and my curse controlled, by my true mate. He looked at her, and the weight of his gaze was a physical thing. "They started searching for you, to use you against me, to kill you, to prevent me from ever reaching my full strength. That is why I had to find you first, why I marked you in the dark, and brought you here where you could be guarded." It all clicked into place. This wasn't a king choosing a pawn for a political game. This was a desperate man protecting his one vulnerability. She wasn't just his mate, she was the key to his power, the anchor for his curse, whatever that was, and a target for his most hated enemies. He hadn't stolen her for his own purposes. He had rescued her. The knowledge was staggering. It recontextualized everything. The urgency of her claiming, the secrecy, the guards. It wasn't a prison, it was a sanctuary. She took a hesitant step towards him, her heart aching with a sudden, fierce empathy. She saw the profound isolation in his eyes, the loneliness of a king who could trust no one. She lifted her hand, not sure what she intended, but needing to bridge the gap between them. As her fingers brushed against the worn leather of his sleeve, the bond between them flared, hot and sharp. His control, so absolute in the hall below, finally fractured. With a low growl that was pure, possessive wolf, he closed the distance between them in a single step. His hands came up to frame her face, his grip firm, almost desperate. He stared down at her, his dark eyes a stormy sea of conflicting emotions. Relief, hunger, fear, and a fierce, aching tenderness that stole her breath. "Avalie," he rasped, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She could see the battle raging in his eyes, the war between the king's discipline and the male's need. She tilted her head up, a silent invitation, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted it. She wanted this one moment of connection in the madness her life had become. But at the last second, he flinched back, as if burned. He released her, turning away abruptly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "No," he ground out, his back to her. "I cannot." The rejection was a physical blow, sharp and confusing. "Why?" "The curse," he said, his voice ragged. "It twists the bond. My wolf. It is not like others. It is old and it is broken. I cannot risk losing control. Not with you." He finally turned to face her again, and the raw agony in his eyes was a wound. "To touch you as a man, as your mate, I fear it would unleash the beast, and I would not just claim you, Avalie. I would break you." The silence in the study after he left was heavier than any sound. Keldrick's confession hung in the air, a chilling, invisible ghost. "I would not just claim you. I would break you." The words were a brand on her soul, a rejection born not of scorn, but of a terrifying, protective fear. Avalie stood for a long time, staring at the door he had disappeared through, her hand still tingling from the memory of his touch. He was a paradox, a king whose greatest strength was also his most profound weakness, a mate who desired her and feared her in equal measure. She did not sleep. She curled into one of the large leather armchairs before the dying fire, pulling his scent from the very air of the room, a poor substitute for the cloak she'd left in her chambers. Through the bond, she felt the distant, tightly controlled storm of his emotions as he prepared for the dawn. It was a cold, focused rage, banked like the embers in the hearth, waiting for the moment it would be unleashed. But beneath it, a current of deep, aching self-loathing twisted in the dark. He hated the part of him that would face Boren in the yard. He hated the beast he was about to become. The first hint of gray light crept through the high window, diluting the shadows. The citadel was stirring, a low thrum of anticipation vibrating through its ancient stones. A soft knock came at the door, and Elspeth entered, her face etched with worry. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her eyes full of pity. "You should not be here. Come, let me take you back to your chambers. You do not need to see this." Elspeth's assumption was natural. An Omega, especially one so new to power, would be shielded from such brutality. She would be expected to hide, to wait for the violence to be over, to receive the news of the outcome from a safe distance. It was what the girl from the Grey Fallow Pack would have done. But Avalie was not that girl anymore. Keldrick's confession had changed something fundamental within her. He was fighting, not just for his authority, but against the very curse that kept them apart. He was doing this because Boren had insulted her. To hide now would be to accept that she was a weakness to be protected. To be present would be to declare that she was a queen who would stand beside her king, beast and all. She stood up, her movements stiff from the long, cold night. She met Elspeth's worried gaze and shook her head, a single, decisive gesture. She walked past the older woman and out into the corridor, her purpose a cold, clear flame inside her. Elspeth gasped softly but did not try to stop her. The two royal guards, who had been standing vigil outside the study, fell into step behind her without a word, their expressions unreadable beneath their helms. Her walk to the training yard was a silent procession. Servants and soldiers flattened themselves against the stone walls as she passed, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. The whispers that followed her now were different. They were not questioning her place. They were wondering what manner of creature she was to willingly walk towards a blood duel. The training yard was a wide, bleak circle of packed earth and gravel, surrounded by weapon racks and scarred wooden posts. The air was sharp with the bite of frost. The northern lords were already there, a grim gallery of fur and steel, their breath pluming in the cold. They formed a rough circle, leaving the center of the yard empty. When Avalie emerged from the stone archway, a hush fell over them. Their eyes tracked her, no longer with contempt, but with a wary, uncertain curiosity. Lord Corvin stood near the entrance, his arms crossed, his face a pale, sharp mask in the dawn light. He watched her approach, and for the first time, his eyes held a glimmer of genuine, unadulterated surprise. He had expected her to cower in her room. He gave a fractional, almost invisible nod, a sign of respect so subtle she might have imagined it. He understood the power of this move. Avalie did not join the circle of lords. She walked to the edge of the yard and stood apart, her guards flanking her, a silent, solitary figure of authority. She found a place where she could see everything, and she waited. Lord Boren stood in the center of the yard. He was stripped to the waist despite the freezing cold, his massive scarred torso a testament to 100 battles. He held a colossal double-bitted axe, its edge gleaming wickedly. He was a mountain of muscle and fury, a true alpha warrior ready for a mortal fight. Then Keldric entered from the opposite archway. He too was stripped to the waist, but where Boren was a monument of brute force, Keldric was an anatomical chart of lethal purpose. His body was leaner, corded with whip-like muscle, his skin pale and crisscrossed with a faint web of old silvery scars. He carried no weapon. He didn't need one. He walked to the center of the yard, stopping a dozen paces from Boren. The air grew thick, heavy, crackling with an unseen energy. Avalie felt it as a physical pressure against her skin. Through the bond, Keldric's cold rage was a roaring furnace, contained behind a wall of sheer, unbreakable will. He was holding the beast on the tightest of leashes. "This does not have to be a death match, Boren," Keldric said, his voice calm and clear in the frigid air. "Yield. Swear your oath again, this time to your queen. Beg her forgiveness. You may yet keep your life and your lands." He was giving him one last chance, an honorable way out. Boren's pride would not allow it. The giant lord spat on the ground. "I will not beg a stray for scraps from her master's table," he snarled. "I will face my king and die with the honor of the Iron Fangs." He let out a deafening war cry and charged, his axe held high, ready to cleave Keldric in two. And the beast was unleashed. Keldric did not move to dodge. He did not brace for the impact. He simply changed. It was not a full shift. It was something far more terrifying. His eyes bled from dark gray to purest, glowing silver. His form seemed to stretch, to elongate, shadows clinging to him like a living cloak. His skin took on a deathly pallor, and the scars that covered his body began to glow with the same faint ethereal light as the mark on Avalie's neck. A low growl tore from his throat, a sound that was not human, a guttural harmony of rage and ancient pain that vibrated in the very marrow of everyone present. Avalie felt it all through the bond, the agony of the partial transformation, the searing rage, the wild, exhilarating flood of primal power. She saw, for a terrifying instant, what he saw. Boren was no longer a man, but a threat, a challenge, a piece of meat to be torn asunder. She felt his desperate struggle for control, the iron will of the king wrestling with the feral hunger of the curse. Instinctively, without thinking, she pushed back through the bond, not with fear, but with a silent, steadying pulse of her own will. "I am here. I am watching. Be the king." Boren's axe swung down. At the last possible second, Keldric's arm shot up, catching the thick haft of the axe in one hand. The sound of wood hitting preternaturally hard flesh and bone was a sickening crack. The axe stopped dead, inches from Keldrick's head. Boren's eyes went wide with disbelief. Keldrick squeezed. With a sound of splintering wood, the axe handle shattered in his grip. He twisted, and with a movement too fast for the eye to follow, he slammed the palm of his other hand into Boren's chest. It was not a blow of strength, but a release of pure, kinetic force. The giant lord flew backwards as if struck by a battering ram, landing in a heap 10 feet away, the air driven from his lungs in a massive gasp. The lords around the circle stumbled back, their faces masks of primal terror. This was not a shifter. This was a demon, a legend from the darkest tales of their people. This was the Brimvale curse made manifest. Keldrick stalked towards the fallen lord, his movements fluid and utterly inhuman. He was the Ghost King, a phantom of vengeance and shadow. Boren scrambled to his feet, fear finally breaking through his pride. He drew a long knife from his belt, but it was a pathetic gesture. Keldrick didn't even slow. He swatted the knife from Boren's hand, and the sound of his claws, long, black, and sharp as obsidian, extending from his fingertips, slicing through the air, was a chilling hiss. He grabbed Boren by the throat, lifting the much larger man off the ground with one hand, his glowing silver eyes boring into Boren's. "You speak of honor," Keldrick snarled, his voice a distorted, demonic growl. "There is no honor in weakness. There is no honor in challenging what you cannot comprehend." He held him there, Boren's feet kicking uselessly, his face turning a deep purple. The kill was seconds away. Avalie could feel the bloodlust cresting in Keldrick, the beast demanding its due. She pushed again through the bond. A silent scream of her own. Keldrick. His head snapped in her direction. For a split second, those glowing silver eyes met hers across the yard. He saw her. He saw her standing there, not cowering, not horrified, but resolute. He saw her anchoring him to his humanity. With a final guttural roar of frustration, he slammed Boren back to the ground. The lord crumpled into a broken, wheezing heap. The shadows receded from Keldrick's form, his claws retracted. His eyes faded back to their normal, stormy gray. The king was back in control. He stood over the defeated lord, his chest heaving. "My queen is merciful," he announced, his voice ragged but clear, ringing with authority. "She grants you your life," he nudged Boren with his foot. "But your fealty is now hers. Swear it, so that every lord in the north knows that to challenge her is to challenge the beast that lives in my blood." Slowly, painfully, Lord Boren pushed himself onto his knees. He turned his broken, terrified gaze not to the king who had defeated him, but to the silent Omega girl standing at the edge of the yard. All eyes followed. The future of the north, the fragile new peace, rested on this one moment. Avalie's heart hammered in her chest, but she did not let her fear show. This was her moment, her ascent. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood before the kneeling, humbled lord. She looked down at him, her gray eyes holding no pity, only a calm, unwavering authority that was entirely her own. Boren, Lord of the Iron Fangs, the strongest and proudest of the northern alphas, bowed his head until his forehead touched the frozen earth. "My queen," he choked out, his voice thick with blood and shame, "I am yours to command." The words sealed her fate. In the dead, frosty silence of the training yard, under the terrified and awestruck gazes of 100 northern shifters, the rejected Omega died, and the queen was born. 1 year later, the first snows of winter were falling on Brimvale Citadel. They were not the harsh, wind-driven flakes of a blizzard, but soft, fat plumes that drifted down from a pearl-gray sky, blanketing the black stone battlements in a pristine layer of white. From the high window of the king's study, the world looked peaceful, hushed, and new. Avalie traced the path of a single snowflake as it spiraled down to join its brethren. The glass was cool beneath her fingertips. Behind her, a fire crackled, a welcome and familiar sound that had become the backdrop to her new life. The room was the same, the overflowing bookshelves, the map-strewn table, the worn leather chairs, but it was different too. A weaver's loom, small and elegant, stood in one corner, a half-finished tapestry of deep blues and silvers, depicting a winter forest under a full moon. Her books were now mixed in with his scrolls. Her scent of lavender and clean linen and something uniquely her own had mingled with his until the room smelled simply of them. Of home. A heavy cloak was draped over the back of one of the chairs. It was not Keldrick's rough black wolf pelt, but a magnificent creation of snow leopard fur, creamy white and dappled with gray, a gift from the Pine Ridge clan. It was her cloak, the cloak of the queen. She heard his footsteps behind her, the familiar, quiet tread that no longer startled her. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against a solid, warm chest. Keldrick rested his chin on the top of her head, his own gaze following hers out into the falling snow. He didn't speak, but she felt his contentment pour through the bond. A calm, steady warmth that was a constant presence in her soul. The bond was their language. In the year since Lord Bourne had knelt in the training yard, they had built a world in the silence between them. He had learned to read every flicker of her expression, every subtle shift in her posture. She, in turn, had learned the nuances of the bond, the way his pride felt like the sun on stone, his rare moments of doubt like the chill of a deep cave, his love for her a vast steady ocean beneath it all. She could not speak his name, but she could send the feeling of it across their connection, a touch of thought and emotion that was more intimate than any spoken word. The North had been reforged. Keldrick, with his queen at his side, had summoned the High Council to Brimfield. They had come, arrogant and secure in their power, expecting to deal with a reclusive king and his meek little mate. They found instead an unshakable partnership. Keldrick presented his evidence of their treason, his voice cold and unforgiving. And when they tried to bluster, to deny, to turn the other lords against him, Avalie had simply stood, her calm, unwavering gaze meeting theirs, her silence a more profound condemnation than any shout. The northern lords, who had witnessed the beast that answered to her will, stood with their king and queen as one. The traitors were exposed, their power broken, their alliance with the Argent Order shattered for good. The curse remained. Keldrick's beast was a part of him, a constant shadow they both lived with. There were nights when he was forced to retreat to the deepest dungeons of the citadel, chaining himself to the wall as the transformation took him, his agonized howls echoing through the stone. In the beginning, Avalie had waited outside the door, her own body racked with the echoes of his pain through the bond. But she had learned, she had found a way to reach him, not with her physical presence, which only agitated the beast, but with her mind. She would sit in their study, wrap herself in his cloak, and send a steady stream of calming energy, of love, of silent reassurance across their connection, a lighthouse in his storm. She was his anchor. She did not quell the beast, but she guided the king through its rage, ensuring he always found his way back to himself. He had feared he would break her, but in truth, she was the only thing that held him together. A memory surfaced, unbidden. The bonfire, Eric's sneering face. Her bloodline is a dead end, she smiled. A small, secret smile. She rested a hand on her own abdomen, where a gentle, barely there swell was beginning to press against the fabric of her gown. Their child, a new life, a new line, conceived not in a moment of reckless passion, but in a quiet, deliberate act of immense trust and control. It had been Keldrick's greatest fear and his deepest desire. One night, after the storm of his curse had passed, he had come to her, his body still trembling with the aftermath, his eyes full of a raw, desperate vulnerability. He had knelt before her, placing her hand on his heart, and through the bond, he had offered her everything, the man, the king, and the beast. He had given her control, and in that ultimate act of submission, they had finally, truly become one. The healers had confirmed it a month ago. An heir to the Brimvale throne was coming, a child of the Ghost King and his silent queen. Keldrick's hand moved to cover hers on her stomach, his touch reverent. He had felt the shift in her thoughts, the flicker of the memory, and the wave of quiet joy that followed. Our son he sent through the bond, the thought a mix of fierce pride and humbling awe, or our daughter she sent back, a playful, teasing thought. She felt his low chuckle vibrate through his chest. The study door opened, and Lord Corvin stepped inside, holding a scroll. He stopped when he saw them, his customary cynical expression softening for the briefest of moments. In the past year, his grudging respect for Avli had transformed into a fierce, unwavering loyalty. He had seen her counsel the king with a simple look, calm a border dispute with her steady presence, and win the hearts of the hardened northern people with her quiet grace. He had thought Keldric needed a warrior queen. He had come to understand he needed something far rarer. He needed a heart. "Your Majesties," he said, with a bow that was now entirely sincere. "A message from the Grey Fallow Pack." Avali tensed in Keldric's arms. They had heard nothing from her old pack since she had vanished. They had assumed her dead, a rogue's victim. Keldric's hold on her tightened, a protective, questioning pulse through the bond. Corvin's lips quirked. "It seems their fortunes have turned. Since the fall of the old High Council, their trade routes have soured. A harsh winter has depleted their stocks. Their new beta, a young pup named Eric Fenn, has proven less than competent." He unrolled the scroll. They petitioned the crown for aid. They begged for an audience. Eric. The name was a ghost from another life, a faint scar that no longer ached. She felt a flicker of Keldric's anger on her behalf, a cold, possessive growl deep in the bond. "I will see them turned away with nothing." Avali gently squeezed his hand. She turned in his arms to face him, looking up into his dark, questioning eyes. She thought of the pack, of the faces in the firelight, so full of scorn. She could let them suffer. It would be justice. But she was not the girl they had cast out. She was a queen. Her heart was no longer a barren, hollow place. It was full of love for her mate, for their coming child, for the harsh, beautiful, loyal people she now called her own. There was no room left in it for vengeance. She shook her head. No. Grant them an audience. Send them aid. She added another thought, a quiet, firm command that was for Keldric alone. Let them see their queen. Keldric studied her face, searching her for any sign of pain, of lingering hurt. He found none. He saw only the calm strength that had become his anchor, his salvation, a slow smile, a true one that finally reached his eyes and lit them from within, spread across his face. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "As you wish, my love, my queen." He turned to Corvin. "Send a reply, my Lord Steward. The Grey Fallow Pack will be received. Inform them that the queen herself will hear their petition." Corvin bowed, a genuine smile on his own face now, and retreated, closing the door softly behind him. Avali turned back to the window, leaning her head back against Keldric's shoulder. They stood together in the warm, quiet room, watching the snow fall, a silent king and his voiceless queen. The scars of their past remained, his curse, her silence, but they were no longer wounds. They were the marks of their survival, the story of their bond, the foundations upon which they had built a life, a love, and a kingdom. The snow continued to fall, covering the old world in white, making all things new, and in the heart of the north, in the den of the Ghost King, there was finally peace.